March 2023. A property management company sends out 40,000 lease renewal notices. Same day, same morning. Average rent increase, 22%. Average wage growth that year, 1%. 40,000 people opened that envelope, did the math, and discovered the ground had shifted underneath them, not because they'd lost a job, not because they'd spent recklessly, but because two completely different systems were setting the price of their life. And those systems hadn't spoken to each other in years. That envelope went out in Austin, but the mechanism that wrote it was assembled somewhere else entirely and much earlier. This is the paper trail. You got a 4% raise on a $45,000 salary. That's $1. $800 a year. $150 a month. Your manager called it strong performance recognition. You took the meeting, nodded, said thank you. Then the lease renewal arrived. The average rent increase in Austin in 2022 was $340 a month. Not 22% yet that came the following year, but $340 a month. Before a single grocery run, you're down $190. And here's the thing nobody mentioned in that performance review. Your raise and your rent increase were never measuring the same thing. Your salary grew as a percentage of what you already earned. Your rent grew as a percentage of what the market decided it could charge. Two separate equations, two separate systems, and they haven't been synchronized in a long time. So when did they come apart? To find that, you have to go back further than the lease, further than the raise. Back to the moment housing stopped being something people lived in and started being something institutions invested in. That moment has an address and a filing date. An apartment building doesn't call in sick. It doesn't ask for a raise. It doesn't take parental leave or quit for a competitor. For a pension fund managing $40 billion in obligations, monthly checks owed to retired teachers and firefighters, that kind of reliability is worth paying a significant premium for. And that premium is, eventually, your rent. The shift accelerated through the 1990s and hit escape velocity after 2008. Institutional investors, pension funds, private equity firms, real estate investment trusts began acquiring residential rental properties at a scale that had never existed before. Between 2011 and 2017, institutional investors purchased roughly 200,000 single-family homes in the United States alone, concentrated in mid-tier cities where prices had crashed furthest and recovery potential was highest. That's roughly every home in a metro the size of Hartford. Connecticut acquired not to shelter families, but to hold as yield-generating assets. I pulled one acquisition filing from a REIT operating in Atlanta during that window. The purchase price, $62 million for a 340-unit complex. The rent roll they projected to justify that price required a 28% increase in average rents within 24 months. It's right there in the footnotes of the S11 filing. They didn't hide it. Nobody asked them to. That projection wasn't greed in the conventional sense. It was math. The math of return on deployed capital. The math that a pension fund's actuaries needed to see before they'd approve the allocation. The math that had nothing to do with what the people in those 340 units were earning. This is where the mechanism starts. But to understand why no one interrupted it, you have to look at the other half of the equation, the side that controls how much housing gets built. And that leads to a zoning meeting you've never heard of. Austin, 2006. A developer submits a rezoning application. Higher density residential construction on a parcel in a single-family neighborhood, 2 miles from downtown. Application 14C. Council vote, 7-2. Denied. The meeting minutes are public record. I read them. The opposition cited traffic, neighborhood character, school capacity, and in the exact words of one speaker, the integrity of the existing community. A retired schoolteacher named Patricia Hoffman spoke for 11 minutes. She'd bought her house in 1997 for $187. By 2006, it was worth $310. She wasn't wrong to show up. She was protecting the single largest asset she owned. That's rational behavior. But here's what that vote compounded into over the following 15 years. Austin's population grew by nearly 40%. Its housing stock did not grow proportionally. The constraint wasn't land. The constraint was a political system where the people most motivated to appear at zoning meetings were people who already owned property and had a direct financial interest in keeping supply limited. This pattern wasn't unique to Austin. A 2020 study of 11 major U.S. cities found that between 1990 and 2019, high-demand urban neighborhoods added jobs at nearly 4 times the rate they added housing units. The supply always lagged. Not because building was physically impossible, because the incentive structure of local governance made restriction the path of least political resistance. So by the time institutional capital arrived with its acquisition projections and its 28% required rent increases, it wasn't entering a normal market. It was entering a market that had been pre-constrained by 15 years of individually rational decisions that had collectively produced a shortage. The shortage was the foundation. Institutional pricing was the structure built on top of it. But then something else was layered in, something that made the whole system faster, more synchronized, and far harder to see. Here is the internal email that should have been the headline. A RealPage employee, writing about the company's revenue management software, described its function as helping landlords push rents in a direction that is sometimes uncomfortable. That phrase was cited in a ProPublica investigation published in October 2022. And once you understand what the software was actually doing, uncomfortable becomes a remarkable word choice. In 2010, RealPage released a product called YieldStar. Feed it your vacancy data, your lease expiration schedule, your unit mix, and it would recommend daily pricing for every unit in your portfolio, optimized against a database of what competing properties were charging. By 2022, RealPage claimed its software was being used to price more than 16 million rental units across the United States. Think about the structure of that. Landlords who were legally prohibited from picking up the phone and agreeing to coordinate rents were all feeding data into and receiving pricing recommendations from the same algorithm. Not colluding in a meeting room, coordinating through software. The intermediary absorbed the legal exposure. The synchronization happened anyway. The ProPublica investigation found that in some markets, rents across supposedly competing properties were moving in patterns that looked less like independent decisions and more like a shared signal. The DOJ opened an investigation. State attorneys general followed. That case is still open. But you don't need a verdict to see what the mechanism was doing. Software became a layer that allowed market pricing to synchronize faster and more completely than any individual landlord acting alone could have achieved. And the input the algorithm was optimizing for was never your salary. It was vacancy rate, return on investment, market position. Your ability to pay was a ceiling to test, not a floor to respect. Now add the third variable, the one that hits renters from the opposite direction entirely. March 2022. The Federal Reserve begins its most aggressive interest rate hiking cycle since 1980. The stated purpose: control inflation, protect purchasing power, slow the price increases that were eroding real wages. Here is the particular irony buried in the mechanics. When interest rates rise, the cost of carrying debt on an investment property rises with it. Landlords with variable rate financing or properties acquired recently at high leverage see their monthly obligations increase over time and in rental markets. Over time means the next lease renewal cycle, those costs migrate to rents. The same policy tool designed to protect workers from inflation was simultaneously increasing the housing costs of renters. The wage earner was being compressed from both directions at once. Purchasing power eroded by the inflation that preceded the hikes, and rent increased by the cost of capital effects of the hikes themselves. And there was no coordination, no moment where someone said, "We are squeezing the same person twice," because nobody was in that room. The Fed's mandate is economy-wide price stability. The property market's mandate is return on capital. Your employer's mandate is labor cost management. 3 separate systems, 3 separate decision-making processes. 1 wallet. Your rent can move at the speed of a market. Your salary moves at the speed of an institution. And your institution is not watching what the other 2 are doing. So why haven't wages simply eventually caught up? The standard answer is bargaining power, which is true, but it's too clean. Here's the specific mechanism. Between 1983 and 2022, union membership in the United States fell from 21% of the workforce to 1%. That number isn't just a labor statistic. It's a measurement of how many workers had a formal mechanism to negotiate compensation against employer cost pressure. That mechanism halved simultaneously. Globalization gave employers in manufacturing, logistics, and increasingly services the credible threat of sourcing labor from lower-cost regions. You don't have to actually move the job. You have to convincingly imply you could. That implication alone changes the negotiation even for workers whose roles couldn't realistically be relocated. And then there's the measurement problem that almost nobody talks about. When your employer offers a 3% raise indexed to inflation, they're using the Consumer Price Index, a broad national average of price changes across hundreds of categories. The CPI includes new vehicle prices and televisions and appliances, categories where prices often fall due to technology improvements. That drag pulls the overall index down. If you rent in Austin, or San Francisco, or Seattle, your personal inflation rate isn't the CPI, it's your rent. And in those cities, rent has been running at 2, 3, sometimes 5 times CPI for extended periods. The measurement wasn't dishonest. It just wasn't measuring your life. So the gap isn't an arithmetic accident. It's the output of 4 separate mechanisms: institutional capital repricing housing as an investment asset, zoning constraints blocking supply correction, algorithmic tools accelerating rent coordination, monetary policy transmitting through to rental costs, all running simultaneously on a wage system designed for a different era. None of those mechanisms had you in mind, but together they produced a geography. And that geography is where the trap closes. The cities with the best paying jobs are almost always the cities with the worst rent-to-income ratios. This is not coincidence. It's a compounding loop. High wages attract more workers. More workers drive up housing demand. Supply can't respond fast enough. Zoning constraints. Approval timelines. Construction costs. Prices rise. Institutional investors, seeing rising prices, acquire more units to capture appreciation. Rents increase. The workers who can afford to stay are the ones at the top of the wage distribution, which, over time, reprices the entire market around their incomes. Not the median, the top. The worker earning $45,000 in Austin is now bidding for apartments in a market that's partly being priced against workers earning $120 at tech companies headquartered in the same zip code. The market doesn't segment by income. It clears at the price the marginal renter, the highest bidder who needs a unit right now, will pay. The alternative is to move somewhere housing is affordable relative to wages. But in those places, wages are lower. The job market is thinner, and the career compounding that comes from physical proximity to industry clusters, the promotions, the network, the lateral moves. The visibility is largely absent. It isn't a real choice. It's a constraint dressed up as an option. And when you trace all of this back to the beginning, back to that envelope, to those 40,000 lease renewals sent on the same morning, something specific comes into focus. Let's return to Austin, 2023. That 22% renewal notice. I looked up the ownership records on several of the complexes where that kind of increase was documented in local reporting that year. One of them, a 280-unit property in the Muller neighborhood, was acquired in 2019 by a subsidiary of a private equity fund, the fund's largest limited partner, providing roughly $3 billion in committed capital, was a public pension fund. Teachers' retirement contributions, police pension obligations, firefighter deferred compensation. The capital chasing a 28% rent increase in Austin was, in part, the retirement savings of public employees in a different state. They weren't villains. They were beneficiaries of a fund with a legal obligation to generate returns sufficient to meet its obligations. The actuaries had run the numbers. Real estate had been allocated a share of the portfolio. The underwriting required rent growth. The underwriting got rent growth. Nobody designed this outcome. No one sat in a room and decided that pension funds should be invested in a way that made other workers unable to afford housing. What happened instead was a chain of individually rational decisions by actuaries managing liability risk, by fund managers seeking yield, by property managers implementing pricing software, by city councils responding to constituent homeowners, by central banks managing economy-wide inflation, by employers managing quarterly labor costs that compounded into a system where the outcome was predictable even though nobody had intended it. This is how financial systems produce damage without fraud. Not a Ponzi scheme. Not an accounting scandal. A structure built one rational decision at a time that serves the interests of capital more efficiently than the interests of people who need housing to live. The paper trail doesn't end at a villain. It ends at a design. And every city where this gap has become severe enough has eventually drafted the same imperfect responses. Rent stabilization ordinances, inclusionary zoning mandates, housing voucher expansions, employer-linked housing programs, patches on a mechanism that was never built to coordinate. The systemic lesson is specific. When a necessity becomes an asset class, the pricing logic of investment doesn't automatically serve people who need it as a place to live. That tension doesn't self-correct when supply is constrained and demand is inelastic because people will keep paying what the market asks long after that price exceeds what wages can reasonably support. The market interprets that persistence as evidence the price was right. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as the incentives predict. That's what the paper trail reveals. Go back to those 40,000 envelopes. The building that sent them wasn't owned by a local landlord who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. It was a line item in a portfolio managed by people who had never been to Austin, who were optimizing a return that had been promised to retirees in another state, who were pricing your renewal against an algorithm that didn't know your salary existed and wasn't designed to care. The market was functioning perfectly, just not for you.